Good afternoon, Prof. Once again, on behalf of the Research Capacity Development Unit at the Postgraduate School, I would like to welcome everyone for joining this afternoon session, setting expectations and achievable goals with your student. Our facilitator for today is Prof. Musawenkosi Saurombe. Colleagues, just to go through some housekeeping rules, please note that this workshop is being recorded and the workshop recording as well as the presentation will be shared to your respective module communities. So if you are a supervisor, you will find the recording under the supervisor community on module. And if you are a postdoc, you will find the recording as well as the presentation under PDRF communities, probably in the next 3 days after the workshop. Another thing, the workshop, as I've mentioned, is recorded. If you do have a question during the workshop, you are more than welcome to just unmute yourself. Prof, if I may ask, would you prefer to take questions after your presentation or you will take questions along the way?
Well, I think perhaps if we can request that if anyone has a question, note it down, and then we can have the conversation after. Because I just don't want to open up cans of worms, during the presentation. And I've deliberately made my PowerPoint not very long because I would like that engagement, because obviously my presentation won't be exhaustive, but I know there are issues which supervisors would potentially like to address. So there will be sufficient time for questions after.
Okay. Thank you, Prof, for that. So colleagues, I will enable your mics probably during or after Prof has done with her presentation so that
Yeah.
you
But
can
if there's
proceed with
anything
any
like very
questions.
pressing, I'm sorry, program director, if there's anything absolutely pressing, then I will entertain that.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Another thing, I will be sharing the evaluation feedback. It takes about 2 minutes to fill it in. We do request colleagues to fill in that in the evaluation. The evaluation not only help us with planning or organizing workshops of this kind, but also to give feedback to our facilitators so that they can evaluate themselves and see the impact they are making with facilitating these workshops. It also ensures that our participants get a certificate of attendance that they can provide to either supervisors or to line manager to show that they have attended this kind of workshop. So colleagues, please fill in that evaluation, helping us in organizing workshops and understanding where we can improve. Without any further waste of time, allow me to introduce our facilitator. Prof. Musawenkosi became a doctor of philosophy in industrial psychology in 2017, in 2017, breaking an outstanding academic record of becoming the youngest female PhD graduate in Africa at 23. Prof previously worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Northwest University and later as a senior lecturer at University of Free State, Bloemfontein. She joined the University of Johannesburg in 2021 and was promoted to associate professor at the UJ in 2022. Prof. Musa lecturers courses in human resource management and industrial psychology and supervises postgraduate research. She is an NRF-rated researcher. She is also known for the work she does as a civic innovator, particularly concerning women and youth. Among the awards Prof has achieved in her journey, the NRF-rated Y2 researcher, the NW 2023 Alumni Awards winner, Young Alumnus Award, Women of Stature Award finalist, Women in Education, Essentia 10 Gender Mainstreaming Awards finalist Positive Role Model in Gauteng Region. Essentia 10 Gender Mainstreaming Awards finalist General Services Sector in the SADC region. 200 Young South Africans 2019, CEOs Award IPM Youth Leader of the Year 2018. 2018 class of 100 most influential young Africans, Women of First Bring Her Up Award, Track Chair Award, Award of Honor, BRICS International Forum, Emerging Psychologist of the Year, Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology of South Africa. Colleagues, I'm trying to sum up the Prof's bio and her achievements. If I've missed any important details here, Prof, please forgive me. To colleagues and Prof, thank you so much once again for attending and honoring our invitation for this afternoon session. We do hope and believe that this session will contribute a lot to your supervision journey and will help you to share more of your experiences with other academics. Prof, you can start the workshop. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Thank you to our participants who are online. I'm just going to turn on my camera for about a minute or so as I also share my screen just so you can put a face to the name. And then I'll turn it off for bandwidth. So this is me. Thank you for attending the session. Please let me know once you can see my screen.
Yes, Prof, you can see your screen. For now, it's not on presentation mode.
Presentation, okay. Is it now in presentation mode?
Yes, we can see it clearly now.
Okay. All right, so we will be talking about supervisor tips for setting expectations and achievable goals with your students, those that you supervise. I'm just trying to turn my camera off now. I'll turn it on again when I take questions. But this is basically the conversation that we are having. And please just confirm you can still see my screen, just in case any shifting has happened here, because I can't see it anymore.
We can still see your screen, Prof.
Okay, all right, that's good. Okay, so just to share with you what we will be talking about, and like I said earlier, this topic is non-exhaustive, and this is why I really want, a longer opportunity to engage with the supervisors and just to share ideas of how we can, improve and make exceptional our supervision approach, our various supervision approaches amongst ourselves as academics. I was advised that a lot of the supervisors that would be attending or the target audience for this workshop would be more upcoming supervisors, but I believe the agenda that I've prepared would be applicable still to supervisors at any stage of our journey. And I will be sharing, of course, things that I have learned as well along the way. And I'm still learning, by the way. So I'm in no way an expert. And again, this is why it's important for us to engage at the end of the presentation. So I pretty much chose 8 specific areas to speak on. Again, non-exhaustive. But the first, well, it'll be in this order that we will look at these aspects. And please remember to note your questions down within the scope of this agenda or outside of the ambit of it as well. So the first one is setting the tone from the onset. That is rules of engagement. The second aspect we will talk about is clarifying mutual expectations. The third aspect will be how to handle co-supervision. Fourth aspect will be being intentional about supervision. Fifth aspect, working smart. Sixth aspect, providing substantive and unambiguous feedback. Seventh aspect will be different approaches to different stages of the supervision journey. And then the eighth and last aspect will be leading by example. So on the first one, setting the tone. Over my years of being a supervisor, I've come to appreciate how important it is to set the tone. I really urge and encourage supervisors never to leave this to chance. And whether you are a first-time supervisor or you've done it a few times now or a few years, you've had several groups of students to or individuals to supervise, you may have realized how important it is to set the tone. This gives you a point of reference in the future. If anything contravenes what had initially been set.
Thank you, Prof.
Hello? Hello?
Sorry, Prof. It was one of the participants' mic, but
Oh.
it's now muted.
Oh, okay. I thought there was a question. I was like, wow, that was fast. Okay, thank you. So setting the rules of engagement is very important because, you need to have a clear outline or guideline as to what is acceptable and what is not. And specifically what I've realized, and of course, as you've already learned, I'm relatively young. And when I started out, as an academic, I was even younger. And so initially I was very haphazard, if I can put it that way, regarding setting the tone and the rules of engagement. I would just be, I'm Musa and, I will be your supervisor and so forth and so forth. I had a very laid back approach in the beginning. However, I realized, I don't know whether, probably because, I was much younger as well by then. I realized that created a platform for taking advantage. Now it could go either way. Sometimes you may not be a young supervisor, but I've learned also that, sometimes it could be that as a female supervisor, for example, you may be an easier target to certain I don't know what to call them, but inappropriate behaviors from, let's say, students, especially male students, for example. And it's not limited to just females. Also, men can be, and have been the subject of such inappropriate uh, engagements from, let's say, students. For example, if we look at the time, right? And some of us may have families and, some of us may prioritize or take very seriously family time. Imagine I am your student and I communicate with you. I call you midnight. By the way, I do have students who can call me at midnight or who I can call at midnight asking where my work is. But usually that comes as a result of a long time, established relationship, professional relationship. And so typically you find that with such students, probably, their family are aware of me. And we always laugh even at the graduations when they finally meet me in person and they'll be like, so you're the short little person who'll be calling, my person, my spouse, my wife, or my husband saying, where's my work? I try not to push it very much, of course, especially with male supervisees. But, with the ladies, I have been known to call them and ask, are you actually sleeping when you haven't submitted my work? So I can be a bit of a slave driver, but also it, like I mentioned, it comes with a relationship that would have already been established. Typically, you would find that perhaps it's one of my PhD students whom I would have supervised at master's, and so we would have come a long way. But I wouldn't expect, such an automatically um, more relaxed or flexible type of an association between, let's say, a supervisor who has never had previous encounters with a certain student. So the rules of engagement are so important. Clarify, if because I was so casual and flexible in the beginning, and I'll just, initially I would go on a first name basis because really that's my preference. But I've had to, over the years, become a bit more tough in terms of this because I would have students, calling me Samusa and, becoming too comfortable. And, I had to obviously put a stop to that. And I would say, you know what, while we're in the supervision journey or experience, I would appreciate if you call me ma'am, or you can call me Prof. Musa, just to maintain that professionalism. And then you will earn the right to be on first name basis with me once you graduate. So if you don't graduate, unfortunately, you won't get on first name basis with me. But I had to, become more, stringent with such because I realized it made me almost like an easy target for students who would want to take advantage. And it's not all, but sometimes you'll have to just apply these rules of engagement across the board. And then communication methods as well. So it's not only about the times. Some supervisors, it may be your preference to only receive communication during the day. You need to stipulate this so you don't get offended when you receive an email, a call, a text at night. Another thing is if you're going to give them your personal number, also set the parameters, rules of engagement regarding the use of your personal number. I actually have gone to the extent of, I have two numbers. Only one works on WhatsApp, and I kind of, I will never give a student I'm not supervising my WhatsApp number because typically those are undergrads and they can be extremely demanding. So I'll give them my other number, which only takes direct calls. But for those that I supervise, I do have, more personal interactions with them on WhatsApp, and we create WhatsApp groups, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So don't give your student a number, your personal number, and expect them not to use it. Indicate to them, for example, would you appreciate them sending you an email after hours? I usually tell my students, you can send me an email, a text, a WhatsApp anytime, even if it's late at night. However, note that my obligation will only be to respond to you during working hours. So because I do understand, as a supervisor, that sometimes they have something pressing which they fear they might forget, or they fear, if they leave it to the morning, then they might forget to send the communication or the correspondence. So I allow that personally for them to reach me, anytime, but I have put the disclaimer that my response will be within working hours. And if I do respond to you outside of working hours, don't see it as a right. It's not my obligation. It's just me also not wanting to forget to respond to you. But make that very clear, what goes outside of the scope of your obligation. And then also the same applies to feedback turnaround times. It's important to agree. How long should you expect, after how long should you expect to hear from me? I usually give them a turnaround time of a week, even though honestly, I do, endeavor to respond to them quicker. But the point is, if you know things might come up, don't say, oh, I'll give you your feedback within 3 days. Initially, when you have your initial conversation, don't overcommit yourself and say, oh, 3 days, I'll give you your feedback. And then something happens. And now, the student will ride on the fact that you said your turnaround times would be 3 days. So you could rather even say 2 weeks, which I personally feel is very long. But except in the case of co-supervision, which we're going to touch on. But make sure you set a comfortable time which allows for any unforeseen, you know, matters that you need to attend to in between. And then discussing mutual expectations. So from the onset, and this is something that can be challenging for us as supervisors, because in our different departments and faculties, if you're in the CBE, then that's the college, you will find that we try to take students we try to supervise students based on our research interest and expertise, right? However, the applicants may not always reflect um, a broader representation of the expertise specific to research topic that exists within the department. So in some instances, you may have to come up with, or you may have to enter into a compromise, for instance, with a student where may have been allocated to you and they have a topic that's kind of either completely out of the scope of what your areas of expertise are, or it is within, but you kind of have a different vision for this research or for the topic. And then you enter into discussions of mutual benefit and ensuring that whatever it is that you envisage accomplishing through this topic perhaps is also mutually beneficial to the student, right? Because remember, at the end of the day, it's their work. I know there are students who will come to you with the approach that, oh, ma'am, sir, I just am doing this to get my master's qualification, or, and I've seen that a lot at master's level. Usually at PhD, they're more grounded in terms of what they would like to do. But at master's level, you will get some who will tell you, I just want the qualification. Please just tell me what topic you believe I should explore or investigate, in which case you would obviously have more leeway to negotiate. But in the event that a student is really adamant about a topic and you don't really feel comfortable within the scope of that topic, try and reach a compromise, but without also infringing on the right of the student to be able to choose their own topic, right? So the main thing here is to be able to agree on the ultimate topic that will be pursued. Also, it's important to advise students accordingly if you know that this topic is just not viable. I've had students in the past wanting to investigate or explore, for example, matters pertaining to like your controversial spaces like your ESCOM, your SASA, social grants and so forth. And remember, we need to always keep in mind the gatekeeping process as well. Be honest with our students, advise them accordingly that this space you seek to enter into, yes, I get you have some kind of a passion, for, and it's a very personal topic for you because you really want to try and make a contribution in this space, but this is going to shoot you in the leg. It's very important for us to be honest and upfront with our students in this regard. Agreeing on project timelines is very critical because I don't know about supervisors here, but personally, the reason why I always insist on timelines, and especially coming from the student, is because I kind of create a mental priority list. And I do write it down, but I'm just saying also mentally, I always have a priority list where I know that this student has indicated they would like to finish, for example, let's say at master's, a student says, I would like to finish in 1 year. Or they say, I'd like to finish in 2 years or 3 years. Or at PhD level, I've had a student who said, I want to finish in 2 years. Others would say, I want to take it easy. I'll do 3, 4 years. But mentally, I would have an anticipation of which students I need to give, let's say, more priority. And when I say more priority, I don't mean I would then ignore or disregard the other students. I just mean typically what would be my normal turnaround time, I would try cut it in half for the students that have indicated, that they would like to complete sooner. And again, it is Some students will cite financial reasons. Others will say, if I take too long on one thing, I get discouraged, whatever reason it is. At the end of the day, I think we can all agree that students who finish faster are more beneficial to us as academics as well in terms of reduced frustration and so forth. So if you have a student who really wants to work and cut the time, I personally appreciate those. So agree on the project timelines and hold each other accountable when anyone deviates from these. And then, of course, there are unforeseen disruptions that may occur. And it's important to discuss what happens, under such circumstances. I personally even ask my students, especially let's say us ladies, I'll ask my student, what happens if you fall pregnant, during your research journey, your master's or your PhD, for example, and sometimes even honors, but I've seen it's more prevalent at master's and PhD level. And we talk about these things, and not to say, a pregnant woman cannot, you know, pull their weight, but pregnancies, as most or all of us would know, are different. They can present various complications. I recently had a student who actually, we had set a whole timeline and so forth. And unfortunately, she delivered very, very preterm, like almost 3 months. So that threw everything, you know, out of whack. But the point is, it's important to discuss these things. What do we do? Even on my side, for example, as a supervisor, what happens? Let's say I have an international trip, I'm attending a conference, and you submit your work. What are the expectations? Should you still expect me, should the students still expect you as a supervisor to submit your work, or will you indicate to them not to expect that because, when you're away, they should rather expect a delayed response? And then it's also important to clarify and emphasize academic misconduct issues. For example, the issue specifically about plagiarism. And again, I'll keep giving personal examples, but I have a student who once plagiarized their other masters. They were doing a second master's. And so they took a lot of the content from their other masters and then they submitted that. And of course, Turnitin flagged that. And their argument was, but it's my work. So I hope you get why it's important to clarify what constitutes plagiarism misconduct, because some students, unfortunately, assume that plagiarism is only when you take the work of someone else and peddle it as your own. But they sometimes are not aware that there's self-plagiarism. And so you can't use, work you used in another qualification and just regurgitate it, basically. And of course, other kind of academic misconduct issues, but I'm not going to belabor this point for time's sake. And then publication goals and dynamics. So, and this is one of the things that has allowed me to even publish from my honors research groups, because I always emphasize to them from the beginning when we're discussing mutual expectations. I tell them this: I expect a high standard of work from you as well, because even though this is a learning curve at honors, I would like for you to publish your work so that it can make an actual contribution. And so, all my honors research has been published. My honors group's research, they have published, their work, because we're intentional about it from the beginning. And I tell them, you're going to have to produce work that's of the standard to be publishable. And thankfully, so far, it has turned out as such. Of course, I don't take for granted that not all honors research is publishable. However, that should also then be a motivation from ourselves as supervisors to take very intentional interest in grooming these scholars, because at the end of the day, a lot of them, they apply for masters and we take them. So if we ascribe more weight or emphasis to masters and PhD, then we're only creating more work for ourselves, because we'll end up getting masters who are not well groomed and refined at honors level. So that one is personal for me. And the dynamics as well, you need to clarify whether you will be co-authoring with them or whether you will not. I know there's controversial discussions about, for instance, with honors groups. To be honest, a lot of the time you will have to put in a lot of the work to ensure that it's publishable. And so the argument often is, do I become first author? Or, I think without dwelling too much on this and creating even more controversy, I believe what is fundamental is to act ethically and to agree, and explain, to your honor students, for example, why you would be taking such an approach. But basically discussing the dynamics of even, the publication in that sense, the publication process. Then how to handle co-supervision. So we spoke about setting mutual expectations, right? And we spoke about the rules of engagement. And this is why when you're co-supervising, it's important for you to establish with the supervisor what it is that you expect from one another so that you can speak with one voice when you're interacting with the student. And students can tell, and they become very frustrated at this when there is discord and disunity between their supervisors or among their supervisors, because I've seen in some cases, for example, at PhD level, you could have 3 supervisors, 1 main and 2 co, for example. So you don't want to be pulling in all different directions, so have the conversation among yourselves and then convey this to the student with one voice. Of course, there will be differences in perspective, opinion, because we all come with various scholarly prowess. So it's important to be very clear about, what each one's role is. Define your roles to one another as co-supervisors, along with the main supervisor, and also clarify this to the student. Points of contact. Clarify such. Make the student aware whether it's okay to contact any of the supervisors, because sometimes it turns out maybe the student is more comfortable with a co-supervisor than the main one. Maybe they understand them better. Set those, that groundwork where the 2 of you or the 3 of you agree whether the student will be allowed to contact any of you at any given time. And then whoever has been contacted could pass on the information or communication to the other or the others. But we want to avoid cases where a main supervisor, for example, feels overridden, where the supervisor starts to wonder, how come the student always goes to the co-supervisor? Although I believe that would be a point of reflection as well. If students are more comfortable going to a co-supervisor than you, then perhaps that's another conversation for another day regarding approachability, which one would have to take a personal reflection on. Sometimes it's not even about approachability, but it's about perhaps they just understand the other one better. Sometimes perhaps the student is male and maybe he understands, a male better than, he would a female. I'm just giving examples without seeming stereotypical or anything, but we know these are realities. For instance, I remember I had, a supervisor and a co-supervisor, and I always preferred to speak to the lady because I kind of like understood her better, and it wasn't that my male co-supervisor was, problematic or that there was anything wrong with them, but I just didn't understand him as much as I did my female supervisor. But it could have been vice versa, so just make sure that you agree who will be the point of contact, and also, is this definite, or is it, an immovable decision that you are making, that it can only be this person who's the point of contact? For example, if you say you only contact, your supervisors via the main one, or, indicating you copy everyone in your correspondence, and so forth and so forth. So that's important. And then also remember, we spoke about giving, let's say, platforms for communication, for example, email, WhatsApp. Sometimes one supervisor is comfortable with giving their WhatsApp, but the other isn't. These are things that should also be discussed and be transparent about them, because no one must be coerced as well into doing what they're not comfortable with. And then again, when it comes to turnaround times, this is also very important because when you have two or especially three supervisors, it can become a little chaotic because now it has to go back and forth, back and forth. So you need to really be smart about this and not avoid frustrating students by taking, a month turnaround time for a single submission. Then, of course, aiming to provide feedback. As a co-supervisor, I always especially recommend novice supervisors to be the ones to provide feedback first, then send it to the main supervisor. I had a co-supervisor before who, she would ask me to go through the draft first and then give her feedback. But I picked up in the first two drafts that she would mostly be agreeing with what I said. So I had an honest conversation with her and I said, are you really benefiting from this co-supervision experience as a novice supervisor? And, obviously she expressed that she was still trying to find her confidence and find her feet in this space. And I asked her whether she would be open to accelerating her learning curve by always being the one to give the feedback first so that I could also get a sense of, what it is, what are her strengths, in terms of supervision, alert her to other aspects which, may be room for growth and so forth. And I can tell you, the feedback I got from her after that 2 years of co-supervision was, mind blowing of how the experience was so beneficial for her. And so I also advise, if you're a co-supervisor, volunteer yourself, ask the main supervisor, can I be the one to give, the feedback first, rather than you giving the feedback first. And if you're a main supervisor, suggest that as well. That will be beneficial. So that's my 2 cents on that. And then also aiming to have coordinated meetings among all members of the supervision team. So let's say, for example, there are 2 or 3 supervisors and then maybe a student, or one supervisor and 2 supervisors and 1 student. For example, if it's an honors group, 1 supervisor and multiple students, then aim to have meetings at the same time. Avoid having, those meetings where people are not all present, because then we that creates gaps, in terms of people being on the same page. And then being intentional about supervision. It's important for us to be intentional as supervisors. And I learned this, thankfully much earlier on in my supervision journey. And even, I continue to learn, like I mentioned earlier. And the key thing is not to rely on what you learned or observed from your own supervisors, because that may have presented shortcomings. I laughed the other time speaking to a colleague from, another, I won't mention the institution, from another institution, and they were joking about how they love to give students the runaround. And, the student was trying to contact them and we just happened to be together and they were like, no, I'm not going to take this call. The student must actually really hunt me down and look for me, at all costs. And I'm like, why? And they're like, yeah, that's what my supervisor used to do. You would really have to search high and low for him. So this is how things are done. Students mustn't have easy access, to you. And I thought that was really funny. I laughed about it, but really, that's not the way we want to approach things. And of course, the supervisor did indicate that they were just joking and they would return the student's call. But, that should, tell you why it's important not to kind of ride on what your supervisor did, or how they approached your supervision, because that doesn't, being a supervisor doesn't mean you're always right. So there may have been shortcomings in your supervisor's supervision style, which you don't want to inherit or perpetuate with your own students. So be intentional about acquiring the knowledge that it takes to be a better supervisor. And I personally did this, despite having supervised already for several years. I enrolled in 2023 for UJ's postgraduate diploma and postgraduate research supervision. And I can tell you, I thought I knew a lot because I had been intentional about, acquiring information on enhancing supervision practices and so forth. But after going through this experience, and obviously, if you're a UJ staff member, you get a concession for studying, and I appreciated it so much. I had people asking, why are you doing a supervision qualification when you've already been supervising for years? And I said, I'm being intentional. And I can tell you, I didn't from the onset think I would learn anything I didn't know, but I realized there's a lot I didn't know once I was in, the program. And whatever knowledge you can, it will make you a better supervisor. I can attest to that. Part of being intentional as a supervisor is accessible. Students really need to look for me high and low. They can't just get easy access to me. Be accessible. Where possible, be accessible, unless it's absolutely not possible. For example, maybe you've traveled, you're in a different time zone, and so forth. Is like teeth, right? Don't like you. We can't get a hold of you. That's very frustrating to students. And if any of us have ever had such supervisors, we can attest to that as well. Being approachable. Again, I spoke about this, that it's important to reflect. If at any point a student is not comfortable to come directly to you, you need to ask yourself, reflect on how approachable you are. It's easy to say you have an open door policy, and I know we are swamped with a lot of other responsibilities. And this is also one of the things that I really emphasize to my student when we have our initial conversations, that, by the way, you're not the only student I'm supervising. So in as much as I'll be accessible and approachable, just know you can't expect a meeting with me every single day, unless it's one of those informal, texts, how is it going and whatnot. But you're not going to sit me for an hour, request for an hour meeting every day because you're stuck. You have writer's block. So, be approachable, but while being assertive as well. But even in your assertion, it's important to be approachable. Being honest also ties back to all of these issues I've touched on, the intentionality, because sometimes you'd rather ignore, let's say, a student, and they're looking for you, you ignore their emails, maybe because you're overseas. But you just say, I'll respond when I get back. Just be upfront with them. Make them know what's going on. If you're dealing with hard times, additional workload, be upfront, be honest, and say, look, this is exam season. I'm busy with marking. So your turnaround time may, not be as per usual because I'm a bit snowed under right now. I'm a bit swamped. Be honest. But what's not okay is just to go off the radar and leave students feeling frustrated. And fundamentally, it's important for us to always remember that how we wished we could have been treated by our supervisors is how we should then treat our students. Then working smart. This one is very important, and it's a part of a huge debate as well. Is working smart really better than working hard? Like I said, it's debatable, it's arguable, but I think considering the increasing workloads of academics, I think we'd all appreciate the work smart, right? So some of the ways that we can work smart is by establishing support or think groups. I usually do this on WhatsApp. I have, whether it's at master's level, I will pair individual students together who I believe are like-minded, or they have similar topics, and I feel they can support each other. And I kind of like see them with the back and forth discussing on the group, and I'm just an observer, a bystander, except if they ask me to weigh in. But I always realize it actually helps to reduce some of the questions I may get or the emails saying I don't know how to approach this or that, because as they bounce ideas off each other, they find their way through and, figure it out. Some of the things they're able to figure out on their own without having to run to you for everything. So that then helps you to work smart because, instead of you being the end all, and they come to you for every single thing, they're able to challenge each other and have these discussions, dissect matters pertaining to research, and so forth amongst themselves. And it's also important to refer them to the various support centers where they're able to get research support. For example, the Research Development Center for Development, refer them to the writing school, where they're able to get assistance with, for example, basic language editing, technical layout services, and so forth. That helps, rather than everything resting on you as a supervisor. Then, of course, one of the other ways I have been able to work smart is to have study blocks. So this is basically where I set aside maybe once every 2 weeks or sometimes once a month, maybe 3 to 4 hours where I can meet with them and we kind of just sit and work on our research, because sometimes the challenge is they're not really finding the time, especially masters and PhD and even honors, to be honest. They underestimate, especially those who are working, how much effort it will take. And that, the joke that's always made about you can sit for like 2 3 hours and only come up with a paragraph. These are real things, and students underestimate that. They think I'm just going to write my whole proposal overnight sometimes. So it's important to, if you can, have those 3 4 hours with them. What I've seen in my experience is that it actually cuts down on 5 6 drafts that would have gone back and forth via email. So if I can sacrifice 3 4 hours and not have to read 6 drafts or more before we arrive at some kind of solid work, then it's a worthy sacrifice personally for me. But I know it's not always possible. But it's just, a suggestion based on what I have used. And then providing substantive and unambiguous feedback. This one is very critical, especially as novice supervisors. Again, based on the fact that we're inclined to do what was done to us. So for example, with some supervisors, you will never, ever, ever have an actual meeting with them. It's always just, I submit a draft, I get feedback. I submit a draft, I get feedback. Another way I've been able to work smart, now tying back to the previous slide, working smart, has been by ensuring that all my written feedback is accompanied by verbal feedback. This helps to avoid misunderstandings because once I send you your feedback, I'll say I'm giving you a day to go through those comments, digest them, get over it. If it feels harsh, I try my best not to be harsh, but I'm like, sometimes you'll read it in the tone that's harsh because you're messing up. So, I say digest it until it sits well, until you stop reading it through those harsh connotations. And by the time we meet, let's say the following day, you find, first of all, they're more calm. And second of all, it's now easier for them to understand what I was saying. But my verbal feedback, at times, a student would have already been frustrated from the written feedback. And now when I say it verbally, then they realized, oh, is that what you meant? Okay. So it helps to avoid those misunderstandings where your text. And remember, English is not our first language. So sometimes what you're trying to say is not what you wrote. So we need to also have an appreciation for that and always try to accompany written feedback with verbal feedback. And then also in our drafts, when we're writing comments, right, our written feedback, avoid ambiguity. For example, I know, when I was doing the PG dip in research supervision, um, I remember it's actually one of the modules I did last year, and there were these excerpts from like feedback to students, and in one of them, like a supervisor could just comment, right? They'll highlight text and then comment with annotation, right? The track changes function. Then they'll just put 3 question marks, which I'm assuming means what is this, right? Or what's going on here. And then you're expecting the student to make sense of that feedback. Like as a student, I would be asking myself, okay, question marks, what is happening? What am I supposed to address? And then you as a supervisor will get frustrated when the same, you know, the draft comes back with certain aspects which are the same, which you think you highlighted or indicated as needing revision. But I mean, question marks, I'm sure we don't have prophetic students who can really guess what that is. Even if you write, what is this? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean by what? What are you referring to? Right. So that's very important to be clear on. And then another comment I came across before was, we spoke about this last time. But the thing is, we speak about a lot of things. So what do you mean when you say this? What are you referring to? And again, you will only get frustrated as a supervisor if you don't provide that kind of substantive feedback. I actually got feedback from one of my students, and I really appreciate such feedback. They were saying this was a PhD student who recently submitted, and he was saying, I just want to thank you for, at first I would get frustrated with your very long comments, but I realized you put in there so much detail that there's no way I could even lie that I didn't understand. And even though it's a lot on me, but I would rather be so detailed in my feedback that I leave nothing to the imagination. And then accompanied by my verbal feedback, then I know that the student is not going to give me this draft over and over, which I will have to keep saying, we spoke about this last time, unless they're really stubborn, which happens sometimes, but make sure the fault is not on your end. And then, of course, it's important to focus more on content matters than grammatical and technical matters. And I know this is very challenging, even for me as a supervisor. I always say to my students, if you know you're not a good writer, and we need to be honest with ourselves, and I will be honest with you if your writing is not as per the standard, and I will refer you to, writing support centers or divisions. It's important that you, as a supervisor, are able to focus on the content more than technical aspects, layout, spelling, grammar. But I always, like I said, encourage students to make sure that their draft has been proofread before it gets to me, because sometimes I will, let's say, recommend or suggest revisions based on the fact that I didn't understand what you wanted to say because it wasn't conveyed in a way, that I'm able to understand or anyone else is able to understand. But as a supervisor, be very careful of falling into the trap of every draft you're saying, oh, this grammar, oh, this layout, justify your text, because you will find that you will get to the final dissertation or thesis and you were not really focusing on the content because you were so distracted by the other minor issues, which, those minor issues actually make a huge difference, as I always tell my students. But if you see that this person is not rating well, refer them to the right support so that you can do what you're supposed to do best, and that's focus on the content. And then different approaches, we're almost there now, different approaches to different stages of the supervision journey. So first of all, it's important to know when to allow autonomy as opposed to independence, right? So I usually tell my students that there are some seasons through your research journey where I will be in the background more than others. So for example, during data collection, I just asked them to send me a report of, every 2 weeks or so, depending on which methodology they're using or the methodological approach. I will ask them, I know usually I have to be more patient with the quantitative ones, because sometimes they have to they have to send out several reminders before they can get any response. But I told them, every 2 weeks or so, let me know how many responses you have, how many interviews have you conducted, and how far are you, right? But by then, they're kind of doing their thing. They're more independent. Versus, other stages of the supervision journey. You'll find that at proposal stage, you will need to put somewhat more effort, and also at times towards the end you will have to be more involved in the process of supervision, because like I always tell my students, and this is now speaking to the next point regarding unique supervision at proposal stage versus final dissertation stage or thesis stage, I always tell them that by the time you have your final draft, your first draft of the final thesis, because we'll go through several drafts of refinement thereafter. But once you have the first full draft, then I tell them I will switch to examiner mode. So they have come to realize that, usually when they are nearing the end of their supervision experience, then I start to ask questions as an examiner rather than as a supervisor, because I will be kind of asking the questions that I know as an examiner I would ask. And it's very easy to recline into just the position of a supervisor. And then you have what we call the blind spots, where because you have been so immersed in this study and this process, there are other things which you might be blind to. So I actually have, those checklists where if you've been an examiner before, what the usually institutions will ask you to report on. So when I start to read your final, compilation, I will be considering those aspects. I'll be looking at your abstract. Does it include all the critical elements or components required of an abstract? How many words is it? Is it within word limit? Sometimes people will say 150 to 400 to 600. Well, depending on, whether it's a minor dissertation, a dissertation or a thesis, and also sometimes depending on institutions, because typically the abstract word limit can differ, usually differs actually for a research article versus a thesis or a dissertation. But just ensuring that it's within the their drafts as an examiner towards the end. And I always tell them that as long as my name is on your cover page, you're going to have to really pull up your socks. Of course, it doesn't always, turn out as such. With some students, they're more stubborn than others, but I always push them. And even when I'll tell them, even when you're close to submission or the time we agree, if I feel you're not ready, you're not going to submit, because I have on many occasions read through a dissertation or a thesis and I hadn't looked at who the supervisor was. But as soon as I start reading a lot of loopholes, then I immediately go to the cover page and I'm like, who sent this? Who let this thing get sent out? So I really don't want to be on the other end of that continuum. So I always encourage them that you're going to have to really pull your weight and pull up your socks. And then also beyond supervision, throughout the supervision journey, you may have to be a therapist or refer them to one. But just, even though we have professional relationships with our students, let's not lose the human element. We're still human at the end of the day. You can feel for a student when they're going through, challenges, when they're going through a lot. Allow them, if possible, to confide within reasonable parameters, and have an understanding and appreciation of some of the challenges that they're going through, because it will also help you know how much to expect or how much not to expect at any given time. So that's then beyond typical professional supervision. And then the last aspect, which is leading by example, practicing what you preach. This is absolutely important. And again, if you did not like the way you were supervised, and you know all the criticisms you had about your supervisors when you were a student, don't be that person. The, don't exhibit those behaviors or traits that you were constantly criticizing. So that's very important. Practicing what you preach. Rules of engagement. My students actually know, I'll refer to them as sir and ma'am, even the honors ones, they always laugh at me. They're like, huh, ma'am. I'm like, no, if I expect you to address me a certain way, I will also hold myself accountable to address you respectfully. If you insist I call you, by your name, that's fine, but I will call them sir or ma'am, just so that they also get used to the professionalism within the academic environment and beyond. Because remember, we're not only training them for this space, but also the space outside. So practicing what we preach, leading by example. If I tell them not to call me at midnight, unless, like I said before, we already have established such a professional relationship, then I'm not going to also call them at midnight or text them at midnight and so forth. And then also exhibiting scholarly practices or behaviors, ensuring you stay far away from plagiarism yourself. As academics, we've talked about, I believe, through various platforms at UJ and at the institution, how we can use technology, AI, platforms like ChatGPT to improve, as well as academics who embrace technology, but using those responsibly as well as we encourage our students to use to do the same, to use them responsibly too. So that's very important. And then, of course, being active in personal research projects. And I really, really implore, especially novice supervisors. This is one mistake I actually made myself, where I became so immersed in the research of my students. And, because UJ has that criteria or the stipulation where they want at master's level, I'm not sure about other faculties, but in the CBE, they want for at master's level, 1 article and minimum, and then at PhD level, 2 articles minimum. And sometimes you find yourself stuck in that rut of always just working on student papers, and your research takes a back bench. I can tell you, I've had to rework manuscripts which I had left lying for long because I was focusing on student research more than my own. So part of leading by example is also prioritizing your own research, so that, and there are other students who will even accuse you. They be like, oh, you're actually exploiting them. I had another fellow academic who said that a student said, no, but sir, you're always demanding work from me and putting me on a tight leash because you want publications. Students will start to even accuse us of such. So let's have our own things that we're also working on, and that helps us to lead by example. All right. So in summary, it's important to make our expectations clear from the beginning, allow students to have their own voice even within the ambit of your guidance, and also being intentional about supervision. We can't know everything. I don't know everything. Like I said, it's a learning experience. And the day we stop learning, is the day we die. Because, and I don't mean it in the literal sense, but you can be a dead supervisor where you're no longer learning anything new. You need to challenge yourself. That's fundamental to being intentional about supervision. And then, of course, finally, being exemplary, practicing what we preach. Thank you very much. It's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Prof. Musa, for such a very informative session. To colleagues, if you do have a question for Prof, just raise up your hand or just unmute your mic. If maybe you are unable to mute your mic, just type in the chat box and then I will notify Prof if there is any question. I see Joel has a hand up.
Good afternoon, Prof. Thank you so much for an informative session. Prof, I just wanted to find out, Prof mentioned something about study blocks earlier. How does one go about the study blocks? Thank you.
All right. So when I spoke about study blocks, I was basically referring to when you have, and obviously this will really be subjective to what you are able to manage, because like I said, sometimes I will meet with them, let's say on a Friday afternoon, and not everyone is willing to sacrifice their Friday afternoons, but I would, set aside 3-4 hours on a Friday afternoon. We find a common venue to sit, and we, basically go about research. And I found that, they've been able to gain more traction than just expecting them to go at it on their own. And they often give me feedback, appreciating, the opportunity to have those study blocks, because first of all, me being there, and actually what would work best is if you have your own research to work on concurrently, because what I usually do is when we're seated, let's say either in my office or in a board room that we have access to at the department, I will also have my own stuff I'm working on. And the thing is, it's easier for them to ask me, if anything is unclear. Let's say if they want to bounce ideas off me, for instance, if they're doing their literature review, if they want to ask, is this relevant to the scope of my research topic and so forth, I'm readily available. So what that helps with as well is that they don't have to submit something, then I only give feedback on that, because I'm available as they're coming up with, whether it's a draft, of, let's say, their literature review, for example, and, a section of, for example, their literature review. So let's say even if they're able to come up with 5 pages, during the 3-4 hours that we would sit, but it becomes easier and faster for them because I'm present. And I will tell them, for example, if they want to include something, I'll say, that doesn't really relate to your study. Then for me, only to tell them when they submit, an actual draft. So that's how it's been helpful for me. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Prof. It does.
All right. You're welcome.
Anyone with the question, colleagues? Well, in that case, Prof, just a quick one. When a student consistently fails to meet the goals that we agreed upon, as a supervisor, what steps do I take then?
Yeah, that's a challenge that a lot of us face, right? When students are not pulling their weight, especially those ones, like I mentioned before, who work, they underestimate sometimes the level of effort that it takes to successfully complete a postgraduate qualification, specifically the research component. But I think it's important to hold each other accountable. And that could be something factored into the initial conversations as well. That what happens if you're not pulling your weight as a student? And one thing I've realized, and I don't know if we all use the same supervisor student agreement in the entire institution or if it's specific to faculties or the college and CBE. But in CBE, we have like the one we use, the student supervisor agreement we use. The new one actually has a section where it tracks, let's say, your meetings, for example. I think further than that, what you could do is account for what has been covered, missed deadlines, for example, and agree on what would be the course of action if it is repetitive behavior. And in which case, if the behavior persists, I would recommend initiating a conversation with the qualification leader. For example, in my department, I'm the qualification leader for master's and PhD qualifications. So usually if supervisors in my department have such a challenge, they will email me and say, this is the challenge I'm experiencing. Then I will try and reach out to the student. If that still does not shake them up enough, then we would escalate it, using the due process. And that's something we also advise our students. Remember that if you have a challenge, if you hit, a blockage or a barrier with your supervisor, don't run to the VC, right? Use the appropriate channels. First, try and work it out between yourselves. If that has failed, go to the qualification leader. So in the same manner, we need to do the same as supervisors. Like I said, in our department, that's a standard procedure. Everyone comes to me if they're really struggling, then I will send like a subtle warning until, if the supervisor tells me they're really not coming to the party, then I'll be like, we're actually going to remove you from the qualification enrollment. So yes, just follow the appropriate channels, but especially holding, students accountable in as much as we hold ourselves accountable and they expect to also hold us accountable.
Well, thank you for that clarification, Prof.
You're
Colleagues,
welcome.
anyone with a question?
Even if it's outside of what we've spoken of, anything that you may have encountered or experienced and you would like, another perspective on.
Yeah. So when a student now have unrealistic expectations about their research journey, and then how do I approach that? Or maybe a student has some extent of expectation from a supervisor, or maybe unrealistic deadlines, like timelines, if I may put it like that.
Okay, I think that one is actually very important to speak to our students very honestly about, so that first of all, I think the key things are for a student to know what's the minimum time within which they can complete, and also to know what is the maximum time within which they can complete. So for example, it's quite ridiculous for a student to want to complete their PhD in a year, right? Because even if you could technically, and I always argue, even if you take 10 years to do your PhD, if we calculate the amount of time you actually spend on the PhD, it won't be the whole 10 waking years of your life. So you could do your PhD in a year, but the way things are set up is you cannot be conferred with your doctoral qualification before a minimum of 2 years registration. So making that clear to a student, what is the minimum time? And even within that minimum time, be honest with them regarding their performance, whether it equates to the time that they would like to complete in. For example, I've had to have this conversation with some of my students who had, for example, at master's level, they said, I would like to finish in a year and a half because I've heard that a lot of your students, they complete in a year to a year and a half. And I always tell them that those students have to come to the party. And if you come to the party, so will I. But if you're not writing well, if you're not, investing in the necessary tools to improve your writing, for example, or whatever other challenges or shortcomings may present themselves in your research, then you need to then be honest with yourself as a student. You need to tell them, as a supervisor, you need to tell the student to be honest with themselves that this is not going to work. The time you thought you would complete in, it's unrealistic for your level of effort. Right. And I think that's why, those ongoing conversations that we have with our students are important. So let's say after the initial phase where expectations are set, after several engagements, you will know, like in fact, usually by the third engagement, I can tell the student whether or not they're going to make their timeline based on, their performance that far. For instance, a student who always misses the deadlines from, let's say, session 1 to 3, or submissions 1 to 3, then I already know by the time you reach towards the end of it, the chances are high for you to drop the ball, you know? So track such things, you know, check, are they responsive? Do they submit their drafts on time and as per the agreed, you know, date? Sometimes I actually, in efforts not to put them under too much pressure, I'll tell them, I would typically like your work within this period, but when are you able to give it to me? Because I will tell you, I will respond to you typically within a week, but when are you able to submit the work that I've requested? So that if you're the one who as a student, and obviously we have to manage that because students can be ridiculous. They'll tell you, give me 2 months to do my research objectives. Obviously, in that case, we would have to shoot that down and manage that. But if a student says, I can give you my draft, my next draft within 2 weeks, then we respect that because if I tell the student, let's say, give it to me within a week, then they'll say, ah, you know, a week was too tight for me. But I've found that it's easier to hold a student accountable to a target they've set for themselves. So that's also another important aspect. But just, you know, keeping each other accountable again at the end of the day.
Well, thank you, Prof. That was very detailed, and I think now I'm sorted. To colleagues, anyone with the question? Well, seems like no one has a question at the moment. Uh, Prof, you spoke about differences in student, and now there are those who are highly self-motivated and those who are not. How do I balance or give the same feedback or attention, give the same attention to those students with differences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one is actually a bit of a challenge because we're human, right? Beyond being supervisors, we're human. And I'm always upfront and very honest with my students. And I tell them, the more effort you put in, so will I, you know? If you don't put in much effort, then if you expect that I'll be chasing you around, well, eventually I'll send you maybe after a month asking, you know, is all well? Are you okay? But you'll find I tend to be more proactive with those who are also equally proactive. So if, for example, we know that life happens as well. So even if you you said you're going to submit within a week or 2 weeks as a student, if I know that you're proactive and I don't get your response within the time you had stipulated, then I will actually look for you because I know so and so, my student, how this is unlike them. So I will then also even go the extra mile. I'll check up, you know, are you okay? Is all well? Then there are other students who I know are always taking chances anyway. They never submit anything on time. So I might not have enough motivation to chase after you, you know, at let's say after 2 weeks, if you said you were going to submit in 2 weeks, but maybe I'll look for you after 4 weeks, after a month, and I'll be like, I'm still waiting for my submission. So the point is also indicate to your students, and I've realized this has made a difference when I emphasize to them that the level of effort you put in, I will reciprocate. In fact, sometimes I'll even top your effort because I see that you really are forthcoming. So it's very important to make them understand that, you know, that if they want to get the best out of you, then they need to give their best as well.
Thank you, Prof. Colleagues, anyone with a question?
Even if you want to put it in the chat, in case others
Yeah.
don't want to turn their mics on.
Seems like there are no questions. Okay, I see. I see a hand raised up. Let me see which is. Okay, you can go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you so much. My name is Llewellyn, and my question is, how do you deal with the online resources that you spoke about, especially ChatGPT, if you realize that students are becoming overly reliant on them?
Yeah, especially the newer generation of students, you cannot actually tell them to stay away from those completely. What I've seen to be helpful though is that in our department we have a study school every beginning of the year where it's almost like an orientation for postgraduate research students where we guide them in terms of how to use these platforms. So they need to have a clear understanding of what constitutes academic misconduct on those platforms and what does not. And for instance, what we often tell our students is that once you're using ChatGPT to initiate ideas for you, like for instance, you go on ChatGPT and you say, please write me a proposal on work engagement, for example, in a specific industry or sector or in a specific context or organization. And then it generates pretty much, a rough proposal for you. That constitutes academic misconduct. So that's how we explain it to them. However, if you already have a proposal and you are trying to discern or determine the gaps in your proposal before you submit, then you can maybe upload your proposal onto ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT, what do you think of this proposal? Is there anything else, other angles which I have not considered, which I should consider to enhance my proposal, for example? Then that would be leveraging ChatGPT as a tool. So I think the important thing is actually the onus is on us to give students an understanding of what constitutes academic misconduct when it comes to your ChatGPT and so forth, and what is acceptable, because we can't really stop the use entirely. So we have to frame and model, parameters within which they can act or use these various platforms. So that's, very, very important. And we really need to drive that across, even as individual supervisors. It's important for us to drive that awareness across. Otherwise, yeah, they might, end up abusing and misusing some of these tools that have been meant to only enhance the research process. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Anyone with the question? Just unmute your mic and ask a question. Or if you are unable to, just type in the chat box or under Q&A.
And also, just on the previous note, I think it's important as supervisors to invest in being able to pick these things out, because these students are very smart in terms of cutting corners. I always say to some of my students, if you were putting in as much effort to do your work as you do to cut corners, you would be very far, because some of them know how to manipulate and work, these systems where, typically, or in other cases, there are specific cases where you can catch AI misuse. If you read, there's some characteristics actually that we as supervisors need to learn. For example, ChatGPT loves bullet points. There's a certain style of writing, which if you have interacted with ChatGPT, you will know that this is ChatGPT. But students are now also very creative in terms of they're able to clean that document up such that you may not even with that, this is, ChatGPT or other AI has been used. So we have to now become smarter. You know how it is when the when the thieves up their game, you know, we also up technology or other ways to catch the thieves, right? Or actually, the more security measures that are put in place, the more the thieves also become, you know, pros at what they're doing. So it's important that as students become more smart about these things, we also invest as supervisors in being able to pick these things out because they do have implications. Imagine, especially, for example, when it comes to publication, right? Then you co-author a paper with a student who has managed to so stealthily get away with overusing or abusing AI and without it being picked up, because apparently sometimes it can even evade Turnitin. So, excuse me. So it's important for us to be able to identify some of these things, because imagine then publishing such work and then you never know, you know, these days maybe in the near future there will be an application which can pick up AI generated ideas very you know, successfully, other than your Turnitins, which may not always be able to. And by then, you never know, you know, and we've seen in the past how, because previously Turnitin didn't exist, but you find that there are other academics who, after sailing through their career, becoming seasoned, then you find there was a paper from years ago that was published, and they published maybe with students, and then it was found that that paper had a high similarity index, you know, Turnitin similarity index, and then these things come to bite you way in the future. So it's in our best interest also to protect our vocation and, you know, our future as well, because you could just really go down for something that wasn't even technically your fault. But remember, as a supervisor, part of being a supervisor is being a custodian as well of the process. And that means ensuring that things are done with integrity and in an upright and upstanding manner.
Thank you, Prof, for that. Colleagues, anyone with a question before we can close the session?
If no one has a question, I just have a comment. I have been attending probably around 10 supervision workshops throughout my career so far, and I have to say, this is one of my favorite ones, and probably my favorite one. This was very well presented and a lot of very useful information. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I really appreciate the positive feedback. Thank you very much for that.
Well, anyone, colleagues, with a comment, question, addition, experiences? Well, Prof, in the absence of questions, I think we can now end the session. Thank you so much once again, Prof, for taking your time. The session, I really enjoyed myself. The presentation, very informative session. Thank you so much for your insight. We really appreciate your time. And to all our participants, thank you so much as well for honoring the invitation and attending this session. We do hope and believe that this session helped you a lot and will help you as well in your supervision journey going forward. So I've shared the feedback evaluation. Please, colleagues, do fill that in, and then I will have to share it with the Prof probably in a week's time, Prof. And then once I get all the feedback from all the participants, and then I will share the feedback evaluation with you, as well as the full report of attendance and the flyer of this workshop for your own record, Prof.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. participants for your time and for your engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Prof, once again. Prof, before I forget, please do share your presentation either with Dr. Lorenzo or myself, and then we will upload the presentation as well as the recording. Colleagues will be available in 3 days after this workshop. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Have a great evening further. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.